Thank you everybody for coming here and being here today. I would like to thank the Message Company and all their staff and volunteers for putting together this fine event. And again, thanks so much for being here today. Before I left for this conference, my wife earnestly urged me not to start this conference with their numbers, not to start my presentation with numbers. She said, well, when you started with a complex chart or a table, everybody's attention is turned off and the audience continues to snooze until time comes to clap their hands. Well, I said, this time I have a good excuse because it's a conference not just on consciousness, but on science as well. But she maintained still that I could find something better to start my presentation with. And indeed, I did. Why don't I start with introducing myself? My name is Leo Sharashkin, and on the science side, for the 5 years, I've been a research fellow with the University of Missouri Center of Agroforestry, working on my PhD dissertation on the economic, cultural, and even spiritual dimensions of the Russian permaculture gardening movement. I am going to Missouri to defend my dissertation 3 weeks from now, but I'm glad that I came here before the dissertation defense because it spares you the trouble of calling me Dr. Sharashkin. And just Leo will do fine for now. I also hold a degree in international economics from a Russian business school, and then a master's degree in natural resources management from Indiana University, Bloomington. On the consciousness side, for the past 4 years, I've been involved with translating and publishing in this country the English version of the books by Russian author Vladimir Megre, Anastasia, and the Ringing Cedars series. I am the editor of the English version of these books. I am married, and together with my wife Ira, we've translated from English into Russian The Secret Life of Plants by Tompkins and Bird, The Continuum Concept by Jean Lidloff, and of course, Small is Beautiful by Schumacher, and several more books. And we have 2 daughters who are both very enthusiastic gardeners, probably because they see the example of their father, who already has more than a quarter of a century gardening experience. We have a 5-acre rural homestead in Russia, 100 miles east of Moscow. And this is in Russia, where you have long winters and just 110 days of growing season per year. And where, for lack of anything better to do during the long winter nights, you just go to the nearest ice hole to swim. That's me, yeah. Well, but of course I didn't come here to show you pictures of naked myself, or you wouldn't have been here. What I would like to talk with you about today is the very down-to-earth dimensions of spirituality. Indeed, our concept of spirituality today is for the most part very far removed from Mother Earth. Of course, we have the shamanic tradition and many other traditions which do see spirituality as being closely linked with the natural world, but these traditions, for the most part, do not make part of everyday experiences of people in the Western civilized world. On the other hand, our science is very far removed from spirituality. When a colleague found out that I was conducting research on the spiritual dimensions of the permaculture movement and gardening, she was very offended, and I had to explain to her that as long as it is within the field of scientific inquiry and scientific methods are honored, we can study anything. But she still thought that it was not appropriate that an academic institution, the University of Missouri, which is being financed from public money, spends this money on studying spirituality. But even today, this starts to change, and I think it is very important to start to gap the divide that separates spirituality, our concept of spirituality, and more importantly, our practice of spiritual practices from our care for Mother Earth. I would like to start with the quote from Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, who was saying that in the simple question of how we treat the land, next to people, our most precious resource, our entire way of life is involved. And before our policies with regard to the land will really be changed, there will have to be a great deal of philosophical, not to say religious, change. Indeed, this is something that we badly need today. We need to come up with a new vision of our relationship to the world around us to prevent the ongoing degradation of both the environment and us as human beings on this planet. Indeed, Schumacher was not the first who held the view that the world of spirituality and the religion is very closely linked to the world of nature. This notion is even ingrained in the language that we use today. Can anybody see a four-letter word on the screen? I've heard the word cult, exactly. The word agriculture is based on two roots, agri, the field, and cult. And what can possibly the word cult mean? If you look up in the dictionary, you will see that in the Latin language, this word means to take care of the soil. And to the present day, the primary meaning of the word culture found in dictionaries is that of cultivation of the soil. This reflects the understanding our ancestors had of the very direct link between taking care of the soil, Mother Earth, and spirituality. In fact, for them, gardening or working their fields was not seen as separate from their spiritual pursuits. And it was only later that the concept of culture shifted from taking care of the soil to taking care of our mind, separated from the soil. It's only later that the word cult started to be understood not in the sense of demonstrating your spirituality through good stewardship of the land, but as a ritual, a religion that may be far removed from the natural world around us and can even be damaging to this world. Well, today we have to reap the fruits of this approach. This is an early Soviet propaganda poster which says, "The smoke of chimneys is the breath of Soviet Russia." Well, but a breath like that is not going to sustain your life for very long. Again, the separation of the concept of spirituality from the natural world has resulted in very, very destructive practices that we inflict on the planet just through our everyday activities. So I think it is very important to understand that we are linked to the natural world not just in some kind of abstract spiritual way, but that we are also linked physically to the natural world around us. That our bodies, our physical bodies, extend physically far beyond the confines of our bodies. And once we come to this understanding to see how it can be practiced in our everyday life. So, do we have in nature examples of organisms extending physically beyond their physical bodies? Of course we do. Here you can see some pollen. All flowering plants produce vast amounts of pollen, billions and billions of the small planet-like grains. The amount of energy that plants put into producing these beautiful particles of life is so great that in years when high pollen production occurs, plants cannot even sustain the physical growth of themselves. Essentially, pollen is the sperm of the plant. And as most men, I'm sure, could confirm, the expenditure of semen, in this case pollen, really requires a lot of energy. But I'm serious here. Look, if plants expend so much energy on creating billions of particles like that, most of which are not used in pollination, because just a handful of these will fertilize the egg and give birth to the seed. So I think that if plants really had pollen only for the purpose of pollination and reproduction, over millennia and millions of years, they would have developed more efficient ways of reproduction and would have avoided this expense of energy. So can it be that for plants, pollen that permeates everything and travels for thousands of miles can serve some other purpose beyond reproduction? Actually, in Europe, in Denmark, in Copenhagen, you can find birch pollen from Russia, from thousands of miles away. Here in Santa Fe, in the air of this room, you have pollen from Michigan. So what purpose can this possibly serve, that these particles of life from the plants become absorbed into other organisms and become parts of other organisms, sometimes thousands of miles away? The same with seeds. Plants produce vast amounts of seeds, thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. Only a small portion of which continues to grow and turns up in the actual plant. Again, the production of seeds, which are the fetus of the plant, requires so much energy that in the years where large seed production occurs, it inhibits the growth of the plant. So, because most of the seeds do not end up transforming themselves into the plant, can there be some other purpose why trees and other plants share so generously their seed for animals and us humans to consume? Indeed, this sharing of living matter from one organism to the other does indeed change this other organism. It is a fundamental principle of biology. Some of you may still remember it from the biology textbooks from the high school, but I'm not surprised if you do not, that the phenotype, the external appearance of the organism, the external makeup of the organism, depends primarily on two things. First is the genes, that means all the hereditary information contained in the DNA, and the environment. So it depends on the internal information and the external influences. Identical seeds from the identical oak tree, 2 acorns planted in different locations, will obviously grow into different plants just because the soil conditions, climatic conditions, etc. are different. So the question is not even can or cannot this distribution of plant material from the plants to other species, including us humans, can affect these other organisms, but how they affect them. Again, in nature we have multiple examples of one organism remotely influencing the growth and development of other organisms. We have homeopathy, a century-honored practice where very small amounts, actually even vibrations diluted in water of some plant material, can drastically influence our sense of well-being. But not all recognize homeopathy as scientific or scientifically valid. Never mind, we have allergy. Nobody will dispute that millions of people suffer from allergies. And what is allergy? If not the symptom caused by the presence of extremely small amounts of pollen in the air we breathe. We have natural poisons, very small amounts of which can kill an organism, including that of humans. We have the phenomenon known as allelopathy. Allelopathy is a horticulture, forestry, and biology term referring to the release by a plant of molecules that suppresses the growth of other organisms. Not all of you may know that a black walnut tree releases these chemicals that virtually prevent the growth of other competing species around them. So plants and other organisms do try to control their environment with the use of their matter that they disperse in the environment. So we know now that the distribution of physical matter from one living organism to the other affects this other organisms. And in case of man-plant relationship, these physical exchanges are not lacking. Plants provide us with air, with food, with fibers, with medicine, with their fragrances, with pollen, with building materials, and much more. We return to the plant world under natural circumstances. Our sweat, CO2, blood, urine, excrement, sperm, hair, and eventually our body. Many spiritual thinkers over the course of human history have been teaching that the natural world produces a very powerful influence on our bodies. Today, however, we have practices that confirm that we can affect physically the plant and animal world very significantly by introducing very small amounts of substances into the natural ecosystem. Biodynamic farming, based on the ideas of Rudolf Steiner, prescribe the application of very small amount of preparations, sometimes a teaspoon to an acre, to promote the absorption of cosmic energies by the plants and stimulate their growth. And these biodynamic practices have been so productive and so disease-free that today the scientific research turns its attention to the study of just why these practices can be so productive. So we know that there is the influence we exercise on the plant world. Cannot we see a loop here, a cycle? What would be the result of our maintaining a direct link with the living nature and maintaining a flow of nourishment, information, and energy and matter, not only from the plant world to us in the form of food and everything else, but also from us back to the plant world? In fact, many ancient practices seem to recognize this reciprocal, mutual relationship. In many countries, from India to Persia to ancient Greece, there was a ritual by which the farmer and his wife engaged in sexual intercourse on the field to promote the fertility of the crop just sowed. Menstrual blood was of particular importance in many cultures. It was considered that menstrual blood can inhibit the growth of crops. So menstruating women were prevented from walking in the fields and in the forests during their period. And this tradition is so common it extends from Africa to Latin America to ancient Russia. Actually, in a small rural village nearby the place where I live in Russia, I purchased a jar of sauerkrauts. And the sauerkrauts were so good, it was a gallon jar, that my wife and I together finished it in one evening. I go back to the woman who prepared it from the nearest village, and I say, well, how come it's so good? My mother used to prepare it all the time, and it was never as good as yours. I couldn't finish half a plate, and here we finished a gallon jar. She said, and this is a simple peasant woman from a rural village in central Russia. She answers, well, this is probably because she was preparing the sauerkraut on the wrong day. I mean, what do you mean on the wrong day? She says, well, the sauerkraut should be prepared only on Tuesdays and Thursdays, because this is the days with masculine energy predominating. I say, how do you know that? She says, my grandmother said it to me. You know, it is not something that she acquired from New Age books. This is the knowledge that has been passed on from one generation to the next. And she continues that, and under no event should a woman be preparing the sauerkraut when she is menstruating, because it will just destroy it, and it will be like mucus from your nose. And as we will see in a minute, there is actually a valid scientific explanation why menstrual blood can affect the preparation of food and can affect the growth of plants. Finally, in many cultures throughout the world, there were rites that promoted the conception of children on some specific dates. In the case of Russia, with a very short growing season, it was around the solstice celebration. This is the time where food is the most abundant and the largest amount of plants are blooming. So what can be a connection between the ancient rites that promoted the conception of children on the summer solstice and the blooming of flowering plants in the same period? Russian science has an extensive amount of research on plant-human relationships. I would like to cite here just two prominent researchers that contributed greatly to our understanding of how this cycle of life works. Here is Mikhail Prokhorov, a professional biologist who for decades was asking himself a question, just why there is less disease in natural ecosystems than in our environment, in humans and the crops that we cultivate artificially. And he highlighted the role of bacteria in adaptation to the changing conditions in the environment. When the environment changes, and this is something that we experience every year, there are years that are hot, there are years with predominantly cold weather, there are years that are too wet, years that are too dry. Well, our bodies, because our genotype, our DNA, doesn't change overnight, needs to have a mechanism to adjust to these rapidly changing conditions in the environment. Well, but we can only change our genotype once we procreate, and this is too long of a period of time, say 20 or 25 years. Changes in our adaptation to the environment need to happen almost instantaneously. And Prokhorov was able to demonstrate that actually a key role in our adaptation to the changing weather and changing conditions played the bacteria that inhabit our body. If you think about it, we procreate at a rate of once per 25 years on average, so human generations change once per 25 years. Many bacteria change generations every 15 to 40 minutes. That means a rate of change 400,000 times faster than ours. Then when something changes in the environment, 2 hours later, the bacteria in the environment will have already adapted. They have already passed on the information about the changes needed to their future generations through mutations and the natural selection. And because our life depends to a large degree on the bacteria that live in our bodies, for example, the food cannot be correctly appropriated by our body if there were no bacteria inhabiting our intestine. Everybody knows that. Also, plants could not receive optimal nutrition if this were not for the bacteria that inhabit the soil and prepare the nutrients for the plant uptake. Then, An academician, Vlail Kaznachev, conducted decades and decades and decades of research on bioinformation exchanges and health. And he was able to demonstrate that even cells, as well as organisms, bacteria and others, can transmit information one to the other through field interaction by biomagnetic or infrared transmissions. So what happens if you live in the environment that provides food to you? Well, the loop that I've shown to you a while ago is closed. We are whole. We provide the bacteria from our bodies to the natural ecosystem that grows food from us. With our excrement, urine, bacteria go to the environment and are able to communicate information about the state of our physical health and the state of our body to the bacteria inhabiting the soil. And then the bacteria inhabiting the soil modify the chemical composition of nutrients available to the plants. And so the plants that grow food end up growing food that has been altered in a way that is required for our bodies, or in the case of the natural ecosystem, of the bodies of the species that inhabit this natural ecosystem. This is why you can see many more people with sore throat or sneezing than you can see squirrels or even cats. It's very uncommon, actually, if you go for a nature walk, to see some animal that you can visually identify as a sick animal. Compare this with taking a walk in an urban area. A Russian writer, Vladimir Maigret, took this understanding a step further. He wrote a series of widely popular books, Anastasia and the sequels, the Ringing Cedar series, which to date sold 10 million copies worldwide, were translated into 20 languages. And that, among many other messages, advocate reconnecting to the natural world around us through the very simple techniques that anybody can apply through gardening. If you do not have any land at all, you can apply the same techniques in a flower pot or a soil container or on your windowsill. The advice given by Anastasia, the main character of Vladimir Maigret's books, is before planting any kind of seeds that will produce eventually food for you, you need to imbue the seeds with information about what your body needs. So she recommends holding the seeds in your mouth under your tongue for 9 minutes before planting, so that your saliva can permeate the plant and can convey through the bacteria of which saliva is full the information on your physical state of being today, in the moment you are planting the seed. And you know, in agriculture, agronomy experts will confirm to you that if you soak seeds before planting them, they will generally germinate faster and grow better than seeds that are being sowed without soaking. So if anything, this also has a very good physical influence on the seed itself. Then hold it between the palms of hands for 36 seconds. Again, this has a physically explainable influence of warming the seed, and then people who work in energy fields will really be able to confirm to you that our hands are full of meridians and energy channels, and they can impact greatly on a glass of water that we hold in our hands, or for that matter on a seed that we hold. Then put the seed in the sunlight and present it to the celestial bodies. Then breathe on it, and then plant it. Do not water it for 3 days so that it can absorb the information it received with the saliva. And walk barefoot on the plot of land where you planted it. And also use water from the food bath that you do every night to water the plants, to additionally convey the information contained in the bacteria that grow on the sweat of our feet. You know, this may seem a little bit far out as a practice, but from the research that I did, I can tell you that there is a lot of scientific justification, like the one that I presented a minute ago, on just why this approach can be valid. And indeed, many people in Russia practice growing their own food and are connected to their local soil in a way that is unthinkable in this country. In Russia, 7% of all agricultural lands are devoted to family food gardens, something similar to backyard gardens or community gardens in this country. But this mere 7% of land produce more than half of the country's agricultural output. Russian gardening families working on their weekends or during their spare time produce more food in the country than all the commercial agriculture put together. It is 2.4% of Russia's GDP, gross domestic product, each year, and more than $14 billion worth of produce. Here is a comparison of the contribution to the gross domestic product of Russia of food gardening and some other industries. You can see that food gardeners contribute to the economy more than the steel industry, than the electric power generation industry, than chemicals and drugs industry, than forestry, wood and pulp and paper industries put together, than building materials, than oil refining, natural gas and coal industries put together. 50% of all Russian families living in urban areas have a garden plot like this one, and 90% of rural families have a garden where they grow part of their food. This is a total of 35 million families, or 66% of the country's population. It stretches on an area of about 20 million acres, and again, as I said, produces more than 50% of all agricultural output in the country. When you look at specific food categories, the staples in the diet of Russians today, the figures are even more impressive. Russian gardeners produce 92% of potatoes, 77% of vegetables, 87% of berries and fruit, 60% of all meat, and 49% of milk. And these figures do not even include their hunting, gathering, and fishing. You would think that if gardens on such a small amount of land are being to produce vast amounts of food, they're located on very fertile lands. Nothing of the sort. During the Soviet Union, the only land available for gardening was that could not be used in commercial agriculture. Usually these were very marginal lands, like this one during a power line cutting through a forest. This is the plot of my parents, on which I worked for the past 25 years. And you can see that it is very small. A normal garden plot is probably the size of this room, if not smaller. The same plot some 15 years later. The trees have grown. The potato patch has been converted to berries and other vegetable raised beds. And in addition to the summer house was built. Gardeners utilize very clever practices, from raised beds to small windbreaks. You cannot imagine how much it happens to how much it influences the plant growth of your vegetables if you have them well protected from wind. Plants are living beings like you and me, and they expend the limited amount of energy they have in different ways. If they are under constant breeze, and if they're either too cold or too hot all the time, Well, they need to spend their energy on reducing the stress of either being too hot or too cold. They need to regulate their own temperature. And this inhibits their growth. But if you plant, say, raspberries like here, to protect them from the wind, not only protect the growing of your crop, you also keep unwanted visitors out. And this is an example of how successful Russian gardeners are in a year that was a complete failure for commercial agriculture. Because gardeners can create raised beds and use other advanced gardening techniques, they are able to achieve harvests unthinkable in commercial production. And it's not just about planting potatoes. It's a lot of fun. It's a hobby that most people do enjoy. It also allows you to spend time in a green environment with all your family and friends. In rural areas, it's not very different from the gardens of urbanites. It's also a potato patch, cold frames to protect the crops from frost, and tree plantings in the background. Actually, this is not something that you cannot see in this country. These images come from almost downtown Minneapolis. There are community gardens sparkled all over the country, more than 10,000 of them, where people in this country grow part of their food. Compared to all this bounty and beauty and productivity of family gardens, a standard, typical agricultural landscape looks almost like a desert. And you start understanding that the reason we need to grow our food and our bread by the sweat of our brow is just because we've deviated so far from nature in our agricultural practices and everyday living. But the physical connection to the nature around us that we've discussed is not the only dimension. Modern research confirms that we are linked closely to the world of living nature in psychological way. There were controlled, scientifically valid studies conducted by respected researchers that confirm that even watching plants speeds up recovery after surgery. Looking at green leaves lowers blood pressure. In controlled experiments, prisoners who could see a patch of natural environment through their window suffered less from depression. This led many researchers to conclude that possibly not just our bodies, but our psyche as well, adapted over the millennia of our history to living in a green, living environment. And depriving ourselves of this environment, we not only break the physical loop of flow of energy, information, and matter between us and the natural world, the same flow that helps to sustain the health not only of us but of the ecosystem. We also break the psychological connection that is needed for both physical and mental well-being. Again, this is a proof that gardening is not only about planting potatoes. In this picture you can see Boris Pasternak, who won a Nobel Prize for his Dr. Zhivago novel. He was one of the elite, literary elite of his country of the time. This is not somebody who had trouble buying himself a sack of potatoes to eat. He could have all food he could possibly want, even during the hard period of World War II, and still he was finding spiritual salvation in cultivating his potato patch. If you read carefully Dr. Zhivago, you can see that planting potatoes was also a means of spiritual work and a source of inspiration for the character of the novel, Dr. Zhivago himself. I cannot think of any other books that presented these ideas as well as the Ringing Cedars series by Vladimir Maigret. It is a series of 8 books that were originally written in Russian by a first-time author. They were translated into 20 languages, and eventually into the English language starting 2005. In this book, Maigret tells a real-life story of his travels in 1994 and 1995 along the Ob River in Siberia. And according to his account on these trips, he met some people who used to live in this area for generations and generations and generations, and have preserved the knowledge, very ancient knowledge, on the importance of the connection to nature and the ways we can apply this knowledge today. That being exposed to these messages has changed Vladimir Maigret's life so dramatically that he abandoned his business and went to Russia to write a book about the experiences, his experiences in taiga, the forest of Siberia. And the amazing thing is, in the very first book, Anastasia, published in Russian in 1996, the woman from whom Vladimir Maigret gained all this insight, called Anastasia, promises that she would imbue the books with the energy that would cause them to sell in the millions. And this is exactly what happened. It sold millions of copies worldwide with virtually no advertisement other than word of mouth. And Vladimir Maigret rose to the very top of national bestseller lists within 2 years after his publishing the first book, Anastasia. And here is some feedback from the readers of the English edition. It's a letter to the editor of the Nexus magazine, published 2 years ago. Basically, these books make all the books that I've read to date look like a complete waste of paper. I think that going through life without this knowledge is a waste of time, and not passing it on to children is a crime. I can say with confidence that nothing like these books exists in the world today. I wouldn't be so categorical with the first part of the statement, but if anything, it shows well the powerful emotional response the books evoke in the English reader. And if I didn't agree with the statement that nothing like these books exist in the world today and that their messages are instrumental to our survival and to bringing us back into harmony with our natural environment, I wouldn't have devoted 4 years to translating and publishing these books in the English language. Apart from the very powerful messages on subjects that range from child rearing to gardening, from religion to sexuality, Maigret was able to come up with physical, tangible proofs that our gardens can become very sustainable ecosystems if we set it up following the natural patterns. He found a garden that has been fertilization-free and maintenance-free for more than 80 years. These pictures come from this garden that produces bumper crops of apples without any interference or involvement of us humans for more than 80 years. It was abandoned after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, almost 100 years ago. Also, Maigret introduced a vision of a family domain or a kin's domain. This is a patch of land on which you and your successive generations would live in union with your environment. And what it would create is that this flow of nourishment, information, and energy would continue from you to your land and back to you and your descendants, not only during your lifetime, but for many, many centuries to come. I've read research on ethnography and ecology from Asia, and researchers did confirm that it was very important for local residents to live on exactly the spot their ancestors had lived, because they were seeing in the plants that they were cultivating the extension of their ancestors. So for them, the ancestor worship is not just appealing to the spirit of the ancestor. They can see the bodies of their ancestors that were buried on the same plot of ground, turning themselves into flowers, into fruit trees, and becoming part of our bodies. And the cycle carries on. this vision of a family domain, which I think was part originally of the American dream as well, having a small homestead where you can root with your family and keep it in your family for generations and generations, resonated so much with the Russians that thousands of people all over the country set about setting up their family domains. They also aspired to form communities. On this plan, each small square is 2-acre plot belonging to a family. But the family domain, apart from the intentional communities we know in this country, really stresses the importance of your ownership of the plot of land. The land cannot be owned communally by the community. It should be owned by the family so that the family can really view it as the land of their ancestors and the land where they can root for generations to come. This is how some of the readers of Migre's books envision setting up their 2.5-acre domain with fruit trees, with plantings, with the environmentally friendly home, with a view to become totally self-sufficient and also to re-establish their link to the environment. Already, the mass media are reporting that a new revolution is happening in Russia as thousands of people setting up these family domains. And a year ago, speaking at an internet conference, Dmitry Medvedev, who this month was elected Russia's next president, declared that the idea of family domains expressed in Vladimir Migre's books is totally conformant with the government's own policies of creating a flourishing state where families would be self-sufficient and living in their homestead. And the next day, after Medvedev made this declaration, newspapers all over the country came out with banners on the front pages saying Russia's future president supports the builders of family domains. So this is a huge movement that, while growing out of the Dacha movement and the very long tradition of living in union with Mother Earth, also bring forth this highly practical vision of how it can all be reinvigorated in our time and become very sustainable and very productive and very spiritually fulfilling. There were virtually no communities or eco-villages that were seeking to create this fulfilling, socially and environmentally just environment. And several years after the books were first published, the movement of the ringing cities of Russia, eco-villages, numbered hundreds of eco-villages all over the country. This is a conference of the participants of the movement in the city of Vladimir in 2004. People express their inspiration with the messages in Migre's books through poetry, art, and even the American publisher of Migre's books receives a constant flow of poems that people write after reading the books. But as importantly, or even more importantly, people try to express their creativity and demonstrate their spirituality through creating beautiful gardens based on permaculture approaches. These are mixed plantings of vegetables and bushes and trees that help create self-sustaining ecosystems. People buy abandoned agricultural fields. This is the eco-village where I have my plot of land. Virtually, you arrive and there is nothing. There is an old field that has been left behind because it is not productive anymore. The collective farm has exploited the land so much that it doesn't grow anything but wild grasses. So people arrive virtually on bare ground, and they plant trees. Some build houses right there on the old field and already give birth to their children right there, waiting for their garden to grow. And others go to abandoned villages, of which there are thousands and thousands all over Russia, and bring back life to dying villages. And this is how my plot of land looked in 2003 when we arrived with the tent. And this is now 2 or 3 years later. Now, I would like to conclude with some numbers to demonstrate to you on numbers some consciousness differences between people of two nations. Just think about it. Russian gardeners in their very harsh climate spend 18 hours per week gardening. What if Americans in this country, which is endowed with much better climate, fertile soils, were spending just 1/3 of their time they're currently devoting to watching television, to working their backyards? I would argue that this would produce so much food and so much beauty that the rest of the world will be gaping. More. In Russia, 19 million acres are devoted to gardens, and they produce 54% of agricultural output, 2.4% of GDP, and $14 billion worth of produce each year. So 19 million acres, 54% of agricultural produce. In the USA, the lawns occupy 28 million of acres. They consume 30% of all pesticide used in the world and produce a $30 billion per year lawn care industry. Again, just think what could happen in this country if people started viewing their land with more responsibility and devoted just a part of their loan to growing their garden. Again, the transformations could be enormous. As it is, people not only in the United States but in other Western civilized world are very far removed from the food they eat. They rely on industrial farming, which is very heavily dependent on subsidies, heavy machinery, petroleum imports, chemicals, cheap hired labor, which are run by corporations, which are very large scale and predominantly monocrop, which are growing for the market and not for individual consumption, which kill communities. And there are sociological studies that confirm that the arrival of corporate farming has drastically changed the rural landscape in this country. And they kill the agricultural tradition. I like this one as an example of how far our concept of where our food comes from are removed from reality. A year ago, there was a United States Postal Service anti-hunger drive, and possibly many of you received a flyer like that in your mailbox, which invited you to go to the supermarket, buy some canned food, and put it in your mailbox. And the postmaster would come and collect the items that you put and transfer it to the local food bank to feed the hungry. I got this postcard, and my 5-year-old daughter saw it and said, "Daddy, what is it? Read it to me." I said, "Well, they propose to feed hungry people." She said, "Wow, what a wonderful idea. And what exactly do they suggest?" I say, "Well, you go to the store, you buy some canned food, put it in the mailbox, and the mail carrier comes, takes it to the hungry, and gives it to the hungry." And this is a 5-year-old child who grew up with the experience of gardening. She thinks for 2 minutes without any comments on my part, and then asks the question, "But what will happen when they finish eating the food that you put in the mailbox?" Well, they will be hungry again. And another question from this 5-year-old girl, "But why are they hungry in the first place? Do not they know that they can take a seed, put it in the ground, and it will grow food for you?" And then she said, "Daddy, when you go to a conference, can you pass on a message from me to the people you will be talking to?" I said, "Sure." And she said, "People, do not put canned food in your mailboxes. Because When people eat this food, they will finish it very soon and they will still be hungry. But the next time you will have to put medicines into your mailbox to cure them of the diseases they get from eating canned food. Fortunately, I get comfort in the knowledge that this country and the rest of the world, in times of hardship, be it an economic depression or a war, suddenly remembers where their food is coming from. In this country, during the Great Depression, World War I and World War II, there were tens of millions of urban families who were growing their victory gardens in their backyards or in any plots of land that were unused and available. And during World War II, 40% of all vegetables grown in the United States were coming from victory gardens. And there were government programs geared towards promoting the use of land for gardening and for growing your own food. Today, this is largely forgotten. What are the implications of it? Just think about it. Our bodies are now scattered in space and in time. They're scattered all over the globe. A banana that will become part of your physical body 2 months from now is now growing somewhere in Latin America. A piece of cheese that will become part of your body 3 months from now may be somewhere in New Zealand or in Europe. So all the food that you eat comes from somewhere, mostly not from the place where you live. So your physical body is really not linked to the ecosystem where you live that has been created and has the capacity to keep you healthy. Likewise, in terms of time, we are also scattered all over the year. We can simultaneously eat food from different regions and from different growing seasons. You can eat apples out of season in the middle of winter. You can have raspberries in November. You can have any crops at any time of the year. What it creates, a very unnatural situation that cannot be found anywhere in nature. As we discussed, nature has mechanisms to design food exactly suited to this location and to this particular year. It's custom made. Just think about it. The natural ecosystem gets information through the weather condition that this summer is going to be very hot and very dry. Guess what? Trees and animals adjust their bodies to prepare for a long, hot, dry summer. Their fruit or the greens themselves will be very different as in the previous or in the next year. But you live in this area where all the ecosystem except yourself has prepared for this dry summer. And you're consuming food which comes from the region where the weather has been different and where the whole of the natural ecosystem expects a wet, rainy, short summer. Do you think it might not have a negative impact on your adaptability to the weather conditions and on your overall state of health? I hope that I was able to convey to you the idea that it may happen in a very big way. And I always wonder whether in this country there can be victory without war. And I would like to finish with a quote from a famous Russian proponent of health through closeness to nature, who cured himself of cancer through self-exposure to extremely cold temperatures of Russia winter, and ever since was walking barefoot and with no clothes other than pants, even in Russia's cold winters. He was writing, "Separate not your thought from your deeds. It's good that you've read this, but it would be much better if you acted on what you've read." Porfiry Ivanov. And if you like to have more information either about the Anastasia books and the Ringing Cedars series of books, you can visit the website ringingcedars.com. And if you are interested in finding out about my future speaking engagements, reading my publications, in a month's time I'm going to post for a free online access my entire dissertation that will contain much more information on the topics I was presenting on today. So it's russianpeasant.com. And I thank you all for your kind attention, and I will be now happy to take questions. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Fabulous. Fabulous presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, too.
One of the things that caught me earlier on is when you're talking about all the things that we put into the garden, you mentioned the excrement and the urine and all that, which, makes a lot of sense. But, here I know regionally they talk about all the horrors of, using your own or even your pet's excrement in your gardens or composting to put in the gardens because of disease and stuff like that. What is your comment on that?
There is a wonderful book by Joe Jenkins called the Human Manure Manual. Human manure. He made terrific research on how exactly composting your own excrement affects your health. Because, of course, there is a valid concern of not passing on the parasites and parasite eggs to the soil so that they do not become part of your food the next season. What he discovered is the problem that we are now faced stems from the incorrect practices of composting. We tend to put our excrement in our drinking water resource. And this is not something any species on this planet except humans do. But he explained that if you make a compost pile in the right way, the decomposition of the excrement produces temperatures so high that it kills all the eggs of the pathogens and the parasites. He has documented it with research from all over the world. It's a very well-researched book with scientific backing of everything he says. Again, it's called the Human Manure Manual, I think, or the Human Manure book. The author is Joe Jenkins. He himself was practicing it for 20 years, monitoring very carefully the state of and temperature inside his compost piles. And he showed two things, that A, consistently the temperatures in his compost piles exceeded the upper threshold over which the eggs of parasites cannot survive, and B, over 20 years of practicing it and putting the compost under the plants that he was using for food, not a single time himself or any member of his family had any of the problems connected with parasites. Your question there, please. Wait for the microphone. Oh,
yeah.
And then your question, please. Thank you.
Hi. I just wondered if you had any advice for people who are living in this bioregion. We would like to put some of these things in practice, but we live in a very harsh environment here. I wonder if it's your opinion that we should, attempt each person here to do what we can with our own garden, or if this area is inherently unsustainable for the number of people that are here.
Oh, thank you. Mostly I cannot offer any solid gardening advice because I saw in my personal experience that even traveling 100 miles demands you to start from scratch in terms of gardening skills to a large degree. My homestead is just 100 miles away from where my parents' dacha or garden is, and guess what? Just 100 miles, but weather is slightly different, soil is different, and plants already behave very differently from the way they did in my parents' garden. So part of the reason why it's so important to have your garden that would not be just bought and sold as you move over the country pursuing your career objectives, really to have a plot of land maybe you will not be there for a year or 2 or 5 or 10 years, but have a piece of land where you know you may go back to and see the trees that you or your grandfather had planted years ago. It's so important also because the agricultural knowledge takes generations to get. And if you keep moving, your experience of gardening will not be very useful even to your own children, because you may be living already in a different region. But I do have a suggestion about this region, and it is the use of native trees. This region and Nevada and the neighboring states have very beautiful trees called the pinon pines. It was the policy of the US government, who owned most of the land there where the pinon pines grew, to chain them down. And chaining the trees means getting 2 heavy tractors, putting a chain between them, and going through the landscape, raising all vegetation down. So these were the practices used and still used by the government to convert these very productive pinon pines to stands to grazing. In the early years, these trees were cut down to fire the silver smelters in Nevada. So most of these pinon trees were destroyed, and today the pine nuts that you get in grocery stores or in health food stores, they come from China. Even though 100 years ago this country was totally self-sufficient in terms of pine nuts. People who read Maigret's books, in which he describes the virtues of the Siberian pine or Siberian cedar tree and the importance of pine nuts in food nutrition, often ask me where they can find pine nuts or pine nut oil imported from Siberia. Well, my recommendation would be to rediscover this resource that is here in this country, because the pinon pines, they grow in this region, they're adapted to the soil and these conditions, and in terms of producing pine nuts, they're even far more productive than the Siberian pine. So my advice would be to learn from this ecosystem, and your garden here in the desert conditions could look very differently from other regions, and the incorporations of tree species, especially the pine nut producing pinon pines, could really help you sustain very productive and beautiful ecosystem in accord with the local conditions. Thank you for your question. And there was a question there. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for your presentation. I look forward to the completion of your work. And I had a couple of questions, well, just 2. One question has to do with the idea of retired military and or cosmopolitan areas that have local farmers markets. Is it possible that the youth and the people in that community could sort of derive the same sense of spirituality or connectedness because the foods they get from the farmer's market are local? And the other question I had was, is there anywhere in your writing, or maybe in the literature that I'm not fully updated on, talking about the cycle of life and how people and families come to a natural understanding of life and death, sort of letting go and having like a natural process of that? And the reason why I ask is because I see that as a challenge for, us here in America. It seems to be a market around death and dying and even grief, rather than looking at the natural cycle of it and accepting it and letting go and cultivating again. And it just seems as though in this process it would be a different sort of spiritual experience. And so I'm just wondering, is that noted anywhere or cited anywhere in the literature, or do you find that of value spiritually?
Thank you very much for your question. Very good questions. First, the question of whether I think farmers markets can fulfill the role of reconnecting you to the local food source. I have a story to tell you. First, let me say that, of course, they are very connected. It's much better to support your local small family-owned farms than multinational corporations. Not that I don't like multinational corporations, but just for the simple physical and environmental reasons that I explained during my presentation. So it's already much, much better to rely on your local food sources, but it cannot solve the whole problem of reconnecting to the local soil for two reasons. The first reason, telling you the story, the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry hosts a chestnut roast every year, where people are invited to come and eat roasted chestnuts and learn about how you can plant these chestnut trees on your property and have very good crops of this important nut just in a few years, in 7 years in Missouri. So as part of the educational program of this chestnut roast, there is an activity booth for children. And there is a model farm with small cows, with a patch of corn growing, etc., explaining where children's food is eventually coming from. And also there was a manual corn grinder with a wheel. You put corn in and you turn it and out comes the cornmeal. And there was one red-haired lad, probably 6 years old, that enjoyed this grinding so much, he kept grinding and grinding and grinding, oblivious of the small line of children behind him waiting to have this experience of grinding. So he probably grinded it non-stop for 15 minutes until his container was full. And the supervisor of this exhibit said, "Wow, great job. Now, what can you do with all this cornmeal?" Well, of course, he expected an answer something like cornbread. The guy wiped the sweat over his brow like that, thought hard for maybe half a minute, and then came out with a brilliant, shocking answer: sell it. You know, as long as the primary purpose of agriculture is seen as commerce, some of the destructive impacts on the environment cannot be avoided entirely. You will understand that the way you grow food for yourself will be very different from the way you grow it for somebody you do not even know. Of course, it's already better in farmer markets and in local food sheds, but still this commercialism in food production removes you further than necessary from the source of your food. Another important reason why farmers market, while being a very good source of food for you, cannot entirely solve the problem is the problem of self-sufficiency. You know, we rely in our lives here in this country on purchasing our food, with an exception of few individuals who claim they can survive on air alone. Most of us cannot live without food for extended periods of time. So, but we rely on money and on the monetary economy to get the food which is necessary for our survival. If an economic crisis happens, or some breakdown in the economic system happens, which will create money shortages for a lot of people, this can create very serious problems because people will be deprived of the very necessity for life, their food supplies. In Russia, this is largely resolved by the fact that people grow their own food, and even though the commercial agriculture really collapsed after the Soviet Union dissolved and the government withdrew subsidies from the agricultural producers, there was no famine. People had plenty to eat just because nobody was depending on this commercial system to provide them with the food. So I think in terms of just the safety net and security, knowing that in event of need, you can fall back to your potato patch or your vegetable garden to provide for your subsistence needs is very important. Next, the question about the cycle of life and death. I think it is very important not to screen ourselves from these life and death experiences in our family and our friends, and to allow children to experience it, to be present and at deaths of people, and also to see the cycle of life and death in the animal and in the plant world. Actually, in the ancient tradition, which I briefly described today, this understanding that we are surrounded by the living body of the living nature went hand in hand with the understanding that death does not exist. Because the life was seen not as a life of an individual human body. It was seen as a life of the kin, the life of the family chain, of the successive generations. And so when you see life as not something that is unique to you as an individual, but the flow that goes from all your ancestors to you today and that will continue on with your descendants, then your attitude towards your physical mortality shifts dramatically. Actually, in Albert Schweitzer's book On the Edge of the Primeval Forest, and Schweitzer is the Nobel Prize winner for peace and was a famous explorer of Africa, he writes that one of the greatest challenges of Christian missionaries in Africa when they arrived was that the local population, the whole local population, had no concept of death and no concept of fear of death. And it was not until Christian missionaries were able to instill the fear of death in the local population that they were able to explain some of the very basic precepts like the salvation, blah, 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 blah. So it's, you know, when people return to the natural cycle, they start viewing the questions of life and death in a very different light. In the Ringing Cedar series books, there is a very beautiful discussion of how in the ancient Vedic Russian tradition, this was viewed as a flow of life stretching from one generation to the next, and people had no fear of dying because they knew that life itself cannot die. Actually, this issue is so important because part of the reason why humanity today in the Western world is so destructive to the government, is so destructive to the natural environment, is that people think that they are here only for a brief period of time, and they have this limited amount of time to take advantage of the world around them. So all the exploitation of nature and the destruction of nature and social injustice, they basically stem from the fact that people are afraid of death, and they are hasting to gorge themselves on everything available until it's too late. I've seen a beautiful cartoon of an old man dying on his bed, and his last words are, "I wish I had bought more crap." So I think that a key to removing this consumerism from our society is also to understand that our life is not limited to the life of our physical body, and there is no need to destroy the nature around us that supports us just to satisfy the needs of these mortal bodies, just because life will carry on even after our bodies die. Thank you for your question. We will probably have time to take one more question and then break.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And the part where you were talking about taking the seed, you know, the saliva, the hand, you know, the sun, the barefoot, didn't seem far out. It seems very common sense. But I was wondering, I lived a few years, not years, but a few months in northern Scotland near the Finhorn area. And then when I came back to this country, there was not nearly the consciousness about the issue of genetically modified seeds that was going on in Europe and the UK. So I'm wondering if you have any comments about that or how we would look at that concern. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I always ask myself a question, just why the beautiful experiences like the Findhorn community in Scotland, where people created very beautiful and productive gardens and show everybody by their own experience that it is possible to live a very harmonious lifestyle, both socially and environmentally responsible. Just why are these beautiful experiences do not spread to the rest of the world? Again, I do not see genetic engineering as a problem removed from the rest of our problems of relationship to the environment. If we want to resolve these problems, including the problem of genetic engineering and our interference in the very sacred domain of nature, it is not through creating laws against it, limiting it, but through our greater awareness of our connection to the nature. If people become more discerning of the food they eat, of the impact they have on the environment, and are inspired to apply this knowledge in their real life, then the problem of genetic engineering will mostly disappear because there will be no market for these products. But as long as people do not think that their life choices and their food preferences matter really, you cannot solve one problem without creating another. Just think about it. People were trying to solve problems of corruption and war and violence and the natural degradation for thousands of years. And they were fighting with all small problems which are the consequences, not the causes. And I think that time has come to understand that it's not a matter of activism, fighting the big corporations because they pollute and destroy the environment, or taking action to preserve endangered species, or to stamp out genetic modification. It's really a question to understand what the causes of all these manifestations are. And when we remove the causes, then all these problems will disappear all on their own. I don't have ready-made answers, but I hope that possibly my presentation today might invite you to give some thought and find and seek out the answers on your own. Thank you so much for being here today.